Hello and welcome to the Recursive podcast. Today we are in Bucharest meeting an amazing people in the local ecosystem. My guest is a person who anticipates the future trends and help people and organizations see the opportunities in them. Ciprian Stanescu is the co-founder of Social Innovation Solutions. With a background in political science and economics, he consults NGOs and companies on social impact and innovation. He is also a professor in the Entrepreneurship Academy in Bucharest and a frequent speaker on Future Trends and Foresight. Ciprian, welcome to the Recursive podcast.
Thank you for having me, and welcome to Bucharest.
It's an amazing city with amazing people, of course, like the whole Southeastern Europe, and that's why we're here. First off, I want to start with an important question. What sparked your entrepreneurial drive?
It was a very purple thing that sparked my entrepreneurial drive, and this was the birth of my first kid. My first kid was purple. For a couple of seconds, of course. For those of you that are not fathers yet and might become, just do that. It's a really amazing experience, and it actually proved me that risk-taking is actually something that I want, and I can, and I like. So not a lot of entrepreneurs start when they have a kid. They say it's too complicated. But I think that gave me a lot of stamina and a lot of courage to actually release myself to some extent from the amazing jobs that I had and actually go full frontal in designing my own company and organizations.
This is extremely interesting because the entrepreneurial spirit in general is for people that are risk-prone, people that want to take risks. And now you're saying that having a kid made you basically begin your journey, which is different from what most of the people that I talk to generally do. They start when they're young, nothing to lose, no obligations, no family, no kids. Yet you did something totally different.
It was different, but at the same time, I have a partner who's super understanding, highly entrepreneurial. She's not in politics. And we realized that this is a road that I can take and I should take. I used to work in large global organizations before, and it was also very entrepreneurial, but from an intrapreneurial perspective as well. I co-founded or founded some other NGOs before actually jumping all in, so it wasn't blank. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think this was the main. Not the reason, but the moment that I said, let's go in.
You have a degree in political sciences from Budapest, yet you are in this NGO social impact entrepreneurial ecosystem. How come? And what does this education give you?
Well, something like CEU, like the Central European University, unfortunately not in Budapest anymore, but now in Vienna. A degree in political science gives you perhaps a bit of a better understanding of how ecosystems work. And one of the reasons why I joined the NGO world, the entrepreneurial world, the consultancy world, is actually because when you understand the ecosystem or the way a system like a state functions or businesses function, you might realize just a bit better what are some of the trigger points, what are some of the buttons to push, and what are some of the systemic changes that you can be part of.
An interesting part of your journey, like you previously said, is becoming more entrepreneurial when your first kid was born.
Yeah.
So you took a paternal leave, something that most men don't. They never do. They just support for a couple of weeks, months, but you dedicated towards raising your kid. So did this experience taught you anything important or change the way you think?
It's a very good question. I think there's a lot that parents can learn from their kids, not just the other way around. Especially when your kid is super, 2 weeks, 2 months, 20 months, whatever. It's not like a startup, but there's similarities. When you start a company, you don't really know how to walk. You don't really know how to eat. So there's a lot of things that you don't know, but there's things that you do know or things that you do want. And perhaps you don't know how to speak the language of business, but you have this pure intention, if you like. Moving away from this metaphor to some extent, something that those almost 18 months of staying home taught me is that mothers have a profound impact on the world. I know, of course, we all know, what mothers do, right? Or we think we know. But being a parent is a full-time job. To some extent, raising a company is a full-time job. So one of my lessons was you can't really start a company or an NGO or a movement if you just dedicate half an hour or 1 hour. You really need to move to a promise to yourself of giving it more time so that it grows properly, if you like.
So, if I understood correctly, creating a company, creating a startup is basically dedicating yourself to be his parent, like its parent.
I think so, yeah. Sort of. I mean, you're the parent and the kid at the same time.
Yeah, you're the parent and the kid.
So you're not just the parent. And I think those people that start businesses or NGOs, and I think entrepreneurs can start both, also in the same time. I think some of us bring a lot of experience from the corporate world or from the NGO world, but in the same time, we're sort of like kids at the beginning, and we do work with hundreds, almost thousands of young entrepreneurs from all Central and Eastern Europe in the past years, and we've seen that they know a lot, they want a lot, but they also are open to learn a lot.
So we're getting there to your teaching career at Entrepreneurship Academy. Did this start after you had your kid and had the realization, okay, mothers and parents in general have a great impact on kids, so I want to contribute more towards their development? Or you were doing it before that as well?
It's a mix of factors. So I started teaching at the Entrepreneurship Academy, I think when my first kid, when Mara was like a couple of months, like 1 year old or something. And then, but I also have a very close relationship with the university. So it was sort of a natural habitat for me.
What does teaching give you?
It gives me an opportunity to learn. That's the first thing. I mean, when you teach, and the word teaching itself is complicated. When I facilitate conversations with these students, 18, 19, and not just I learn from them a lot, but I also need to learn what we talk about or what I would teach them, if you like. First of all, because what I teach is not a very static. So the dimensions of what I teach are very flexible and completely changeable from once every 2 years. Because I teach foresight and futurism. I teach sustainability. I teach leadership. And these things do change. And the examples that we have, or the examples that are worth mentioning, should change as well. If we talk about business or transformation or business transformation, and we just talk about how Kodak did something, so if we just stick to the classical models, the big ones, there's not really going to be, I think, an enough lesson for a startup to the beginning. You need to look for what happened with that startup in Bulgaria. So you need to go to sort of similar geographies, roughly similar cultures, and similar levels of entrepreneurial ecosystem development. If you talk about entrepreneurship to Romanian startups, and you give examples from Silicon Valley or Osaka or
London,
Chile, for that matter, it's very good. But there's a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
Right?
It's the context, isn't it?
It's always the context.
Great. You are teaching these very, very important topics sharing and facilitating these important topics towards these young and very striving entrepreneurs. How do you keep yourself updated on them?
I need to keep updated because they also know a lot. So I don't think teachers these days, especially in these soft, if you like, sciences, so not engineering. Information is out there. You don't really have a secret that you want to share. What you do, what we might have, is is a better understanding on where to look, how to look, and why to look for some types of information. We might have some models. So that's why I also need to be quite updated when I teach. In the same time, in our work at CIS, we also need to be highly updated, if you like, because we, in the same time, either work with big companies and we can't really afford not to know what's going on or what might happen in that industry or that regulatory framework.
From one of the interviews that I've read, you were talking about the most important lessons for the award that you're giving, the Social Impact Awards. And you were telling about the importance of how good failing is. So, how do you teach young people that failing once is not a bad thing and it's not an end to the story?
I think, especially in cultures that are not very open to failing, one way to teach failing is to talk about it, first of all, quite a lot, to understand what failing means, actually. So it's not a failure to the people you love, but a failure is a normal and even a healthy part of success. We shouldn't fail every day. But sometimes failure might be good for a business, for an individual, for a team, because it gives us the opportunity to go back and find a new way. Sometimes failing with your business has nothing to do. You can be really amazing, but sometimes something happens outside of your industry, or COVID happens or whatever, and that's still a failure. But it's not just a failure of what you could have done, but it's also a failure that comes from something that you cannot really control. So failure comes, it's sort of a combo. You need to understand that failure happens and it's okay, but it needs to come with a sort of a plan B. What happens if I fail? What happens if my business doesn't get that investment, or if it gets that investment and we can't deliver, etc.? So what's sort of a plan B and even a plan C for that matter?
So one thing in common that you see towards the participants in the Social Innovation Awards is the fact that they have this desire to change, to make a change, to change the world. So what do you think formed this aspiration in these young people? Because prior to our times, there was less information. So these people are basically creating something brand new that was never developed before, like Instagram. And
so we have reached the 10th year of Social Impact Award in Romania. This is a global competition that happens in 18 countries, I think, at this point, from Uganda to Germany and from Kazakhstan to Serbia. And not just that, but also with Future Makers and other incubators that we're running. When we talk about why young people, anybody actually, would start a business that has a social impact perspective or a social innovation perspective, I think there's a lot to do with a better understanding that we can have a role, we can be part of this realistic change, if you like. There's a lot of declarative change making, but you can see examples. So I think the pioneers, if you like, of making businesses not just for profit, and it's okay to make business for profit, okay, but if you want to talk about these pioneers in many countries, I think they really inspired people to look at this and say, we can do that. Something that we do once a year is that we ask young people around the country, in Romania, for example, why would they get a job or why would they start a business? And the more time passes, the more it's about having an impact, playing a bigger role. It's not about the money. It's not about success. It's not about ego anymore, or not that much to some extent. So I think, and I have a sort of a quote from somebody that won Future Makers a couple of years ago, and also won Social Impact Award. And they say something like, the reason why we're not quitting, because that's also an interesting conversation. The reason why we're not quitting is that we feel that if we quit, others will quit as well. So if you reversed it, We do this because we feel that if we win or if we have an impact, others will follow as well.
Yeah. Leading by example, isn't it?
I think that's a big type of leadership that we can all play, but also showing what we do, not living in isolation and I do it, and using platforms like the Recursive to actually bring more inspiration and change.
What kind of role does technology play in solving social issues, according to you?
Guys, I'm going to be super honest. None. Zero. Technology plays zero role. It has no role. But if it's used properly, it has a huge role. I mean, technology in itself, without a business model attached to it or an impact model, is not necessarily useless. But it doesn't deliver what, if you want to solve a problem and you say, we have, I don't know, super cool tablets, right? And this is not going to fix the digital gap education. We need to put something else in there. We need to put people there that know how to transfer knowledge, to make teachers understand how to use it, why to use it, when to use it. So, technology in itself, I don't really see it as a key. I think this merger between technology, impact-driven organizations and leaders is what can really multiply the impact that many of us have. I think if you just take artificial intelligence, let's pick one of the many, right? In itself, it might lead to impact, but not that much. But if you use it, if you look at a technology as a tool, as it should be, not just as a profit maker, then you might actually be able to do that. If you have a problem, so you work, you have a business in the energy sector, right? Climate change, if you like. Something that we do, for example, is we do a tech audit. We go with startups or social ventures, and we go through about 10 types of technology and say, okay, what do they mean? Can you use any of them to make your impact bigger or to grow your business? And when you talk about AI, most of people, 99% of people know AI, but they don't know what it does. They perhaps don't even know that it doesn't really exist properly. There's machine learning and these combinations. So what I think is that technology can play a major and really significant role in how we change the world, but we need to be the ones using it, not just letting ourselves, on the back and saying, we have technology.
Yeah. So human is in the center of it.
I think not just humans, but really understanding not just the solution, which is in this case technology, but really understanding some of the causes of the problems and even going straight to see how technology can solve a cause, not just the effect of a problem.
We go into our Blitz Round, Ciprian. I start my day with
waking up my kids and getting them ready for school, cooking, like mini cooking.
What makes me laugh is
there's a lot of stuff that I do a lot of jokes, and sometimes I laugh at my own jokes, but usually my kids make me laugh a lot.
The book that I recommend most often is?
I think Factfulness by Hans Rosling. That was a really good book.
And the last book that I read?
John Doerr, Measure What Matters. I didn't finish it. I have one more chapter, but I feel I got the point.
Sport is my way to
reconnect with my younger version when I could run really fast.
I love working in technology because
it makes me understand that life can actually be simpler.
My role model is?
I don't have a role model.
The smartest decision that I made up to date was?
The smartest professional decision of my life has been and will always be staying home with my kid, giving up my career and doing something else.
Spectacular. And my mission is to?
support, help, and challenge entrepreneurs and organizations, and ideally policymakers to look at the future differently and act accordingly.
Are there other fundamentals or limitations that businesses should keep in mind when aiming for social impact? Like you started with the technology. Are there things that they're missing, aiming at, I want to reach this social impact, I want to influence our society in a way, but there is something that they forget about when starting or while trying to?
We've worked at CIS with roughly 400 startups or startup ideas so far, maybe 500. And there's a couple of things that are not there for all of them. So some of them do have it. And I would put a word that is not about social impact, but about sustainability, which could also encompass to some extent that. Sometimes entrepreneurs forget about themselves and about their teams, and they put too much pressure on themselves, on success, on KPIs, on numbers. They, to some extent, become martyrs, because they do it all, right?
Yeah.
There's no solution, of course, to that. But this human sustainability part of a business is critical. At the same time, something else that we see, and we also try to help with that, is understanding that options are not limited and opportunities are unlimited. So when let's say you have a startup in media, right? You have a podcast, for example. Let's say, just put it out there. You have some options, right? You have, 2-3 options of doing it, making money out of it, having an impact. But perhaps there's some options that you're not looking at. Most likely there's opportunities that you are really not taking advantage of. Either topic related, funding related, sharing models, if you like, of a business. It doesn't necessarily need to be only your business, franchising it, etc. So what we do live these days in a sort of a luxury time. There's a luxury of opportunities. The more we have, the less we seem to take. So it's not about having less opportunities, but really knowing how to look for them, when to look for them, and having a very clear decision-making process within the startup or the NGO on where and how you go forward.
I'll get you back on martyrs, because if I understood correctly, you're saying that startup founders are basically putting themselves so much into the startup that they're losing their relationships, their health, they're like ruining their lives in general, not only theirs, but also their teams, like with hustling. And this is something that should be taken into account. So sustainability means some kind of balance, or how would you define it?
I think it's about balance, but it's not just about balance, because you usually balance two things. That's the physical. But there's more than two as an entrepreneur. You have yourself, you have perhaps your team, then you have your personal life to some extent, if you have some or any. Then you have long-term ideas. So there's a lot of, I would rather use the term of juggling.
Yeah.
So, and that's a problem, because when you juggle, you really focus on that. You're really looking at the whatever you juggle with. So you don't really look around and see what else is there. So what we see, for example, we have a fellowship that is within Southeast Europe to some extent. And in this Future Youth Fellowship, we asked these 100 fellows last year and this year, what is one of the biggest challenges that this generation of impact-driven entrepreneurs has? And number one wasn't capital, wasn't scaling. It was mental health or well-being of entrepreneurs.
Wow.
We do similarly in our impact assessments for social impact award all around the world. Again, you take Uganda, you take Kazakhstan, You take Greece, Germany these days, doesn't matter. Any country that we work in, what do you think is the top three, sometimes number one, worry or challenge that we feel? Is that we're not gonna stay sane or healthy on the long run.
Burnout.
Yeah. And when you talk to senior business leaders and they look at you and say, you're 22. What do you mean burnout? You don't know what burnout is. So burnout or stress or depression are not necessarily something very, it's like failure,
Yeah.
We don't talk about it.
Yeah. The elephant in the room, isn't it?
I think there's a lot of there's a herd.
Yeah, herd of elephants. All right. How did you, Ciprian, how did you manage to learn this concept about, while juggling, looking around? So how did you learn to look at the big picture? For me personally, this is extremely hard.
I learned by not doing it. So I didn't do it properly. I don't really do it always. But there were times in which if I would have been, I don't know, a bigger organization or whatever. So I lost some opportunities because I was focused on very operational stuff as well. So, if I were to give a couple of pieces of advice that I would have loved to get when I was 20 something.
You're reading my mind.
Okay. Let's say you have a startup and it's growing. You might get your first investment. Why not? Or not. But you're growing, or you're a social venture that starts to grow. So you're like 2, 3, 4 years old. Something that is super important is I think, is to get an advisory board. So you go to some of the people that you look up to in your society, in your country, in your city, in the region, whatever. And you get a 5, 6, 7 people and you say, hey guys, I need your help. And ladies, I don't know, I don't think I'm asking myself all the right questions. Or there's questions that I shouldn't be asking myself. So, you get out when you ask people what they think about what you do. So it's not your classical, I don't know, feedback session. It's an advisory board that puts a lot of time, and they're senior people, so they might have some pretty good advice. And another one is if you have teams. Usually entrepreneurs don't really have teams, but we should. If you have a team of 2, which is a team of 2 is a team, try to get at least twice a year a weekend off, or 2 consecutive days where you don't talk about what happens next week, but what happens next year. Try to have these strategy sessions.
Awesome.
And then you might, hear some other stuff.
So going back to the health part, how do you keep your work-life balance?
It's not easy, especially in the past year and a half. If you're an entrepreneur or an employee and you have kids, you know what I mean, right? Online school, it's really complicated. So how we maintain our balance or equilibrium is by trying, when we have the kids at home, to not work. It's not easy because the life of entrepreneurs, and in my partner's case, politics never ends. Really never ends. Entrepreneurship might take some breaks. So we try to find time. We try to leave outside of the city as much as possible. We have a promise that we keep to ourselves. Once a year, we take a month off, 2 months off. We bought a trailer. We go around the country. We spend 2, 3 weeks at the beach. We don't try to disconnect, because I think that's a mistake. We don't live for holidays.
Sorry. You don't try to disconnect. Thank you.
Yeah. So we don't try to disconnect, because if you disconnect, then you're doing something wrong with your life, professionally speaking. So we keep connected, but we take more time to play, that's the thing.
I have a favorite saying, an idiom phrase. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
True. But at the same time, Jack is no longer a boy. Now he's a man. So.
How important is playing in entrepreneurship anyway?
I think playing, what is to play, right? Sometimes it's about rules. Like you play football, there's rules. Lego, whatever, right? Sometimes you can play football or you can do a Lego without rules. You can be creative. So I think playing in the entrepreneurial world is a mix between what you really need to do. You should have some KPIs. You should have some objectives. You should have some processes, innovation process, management process, etc., within the team and within yourself as an entrepreneur. But in the same time, playing, just I have this idea, let's run it and let's play with it. Let's have some money invested. Let's have some skin in the game. This is another book that I recommend, Skin in the Game. And if you do that, if you manage to have this balance of when you play, I think the score is going to be in your favor.
Going back to playing yet teams, why is building teams or communities important? Let's start with teams, then switch to communities. Why is it important to have a team? You said points of view and having different perspectives towards the problem, but in the term of games, you cannot play the game solo. It's always better to have someone with you. So
I have a question for you, actually. Yeah. What sort of an animal are we? Are we an animal that can live alone like a vulture would?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we an animal like a hyena, like a
herd?
So if you look from a biological perspective, to a large extent, although we might like to work alone, maybe we're leaders of the pack, but we need a pack. So sometimes, and I'm a big fan of the animal kingdom, if you like. I think we're very much part of the animal kingdom. Okay, we might have really smart smartphones, but in the end, we're not very, very different in the way we behave to each other. So I think a team is essential for any type of mission that you might have. Even if you're a sports person or, boxers are good because they have good teams, etc. So I think it's, if there's this saying, if you want to go far,
go together.
We're going to go and do that. But I think at one point, if you just do it all by yourself or you have a really small team, sometimes you need somebody to catch you as well. I think that's also important.
Okay, how this, let's switch to communities, because you are teaching teams of entrepreneurs, which are inspiring the following teams. So this whole community of more than 400 startups that went through CIS basically is forming an ecosystem. And how important is this community of this ecosystem of young entrepreneurs that are finding problems and solving them and looking for solutions?
I'm going to be really honest with you. I think many of us live in an era, and pardon my French, we live in an era of bullshit. And the bullshit comes from saying, I have this community. A lot of organizations say we have this global community. A lot of companies say we have this super amazing community. But we all bullshit a bit. Because we really believe we have it, but actually, I'm not sure if we do. What is a community in the end? A community is a living organism. It's an organic organism. If you have a community of entrepreneurs that needs to be active or can be active only when the organization that made it, sends an email, that's not a community. That's a database, if you like. The question that we all, I think, need to ask ourselves in this area of creating communities and change is actually, how do you have a living community that is ideally independent and has its own ideas, even if it's big. How do you instill a sense of shared mission and contribution to a lot of people that you shouldn't, again, control to some extent? And this is why I say that we oversell, many of us, when we say we have a community. I don't think, honestly speaking, I'm not sure if we have a community. We have a lot of people, groups of people that refer to themselves as part of this community. But in the same time, being, all of us need to understand that it's not easy to build communities. And you need somebody that does that. The CEO should do that. You need a community organizer.
Okay. So what you're saying reminds me of a book that I read, which was reviewing the difference between a spider, a centralized organization, and a starfish, which is a decentralized organization, which basically has this way to basically cut a piece of it, and there's a new star born out of the piece, and the new leg, like to the old star.
Yeah.
So
this is a social movement. This is what I think all should try to build as much as possible. We're not gonna. It's super complicated to build a flock of birds that flies in that direction, and there's no leader. Everyone is a leader, and everyone is a follower in the same time. But they all believe in something. They all strive for something, and they go sometimes in a wrong way, but they come back.
Having the experience that you've gathered through this process, what do you think that the future holds in front of this particular ecosystem that we are referring to at the moment, like these entrepreneurs that are based here in and around Bucharest and that you've seen?
So now we're trying to build a group, not a community yet, a group of entrepreneurs, organizations, and people that you would see on the Recursive from Central and Eastern Europe, with the intention of also building an impact investment fund at a regional level. What we see is that when we look at the future, there's a lot of opportunities. I think this extended region, Central and Eastern Europe, doesn't really have an identity of itself, doesn't really have a strong entrepreneurial identity. And I think we can all gather and make this happen. There's a lot of opportunities. I think we can become a new type of model if we really share resources, not just PR. In the same time, there's also a lot of risks ahead. And it's not necessarily connected to how we are as entrepreneurs or hubs or magazines. I think it's connected to the societies in which we live in. And it's highly connected to the rise of nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and all the others that we see more and more, especially in this region, but all around the world. I think we live in dangerous times, but the real danger is not taking any measure and not really opening the conversation about the future to everyone. Because if we just talk to ourselves and the rest of the population stays disengaged, what do you think will happen in the end? We will be the minority that will think about very intellectual systems change, right? VC, all the buzzwords, AI, whilst the other part of the population that sometimes we might say, they don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then, so when I look at the future of the region and to some extent of Europe, I'm optimist, but I'm also cautious.
Yeah. You were referring to a bubble, weren't you? We are living in bubbles.
I think, do you know those, when you wrap up a box in a bubble thing?
Yeah.
I think this is how societies to some extent look like. The problem is that we think we're the biggest and the best, the brightest and the smartest bubble. I'm not sure if we should think like that.
Awesome. You mentioned societies, and previously we talked about being the leader and leading by example. Do societies really get impacted that much by standout examples like UiPath, like Telerik in Bulgaria, or they just really believe that these are some totally like bubble guys, very smart, and they don't, this is not part of the real life that happens?
I think societies in themselves are a very dangerous concept to talk about because it feels like we talk about one thing. So, yes, you can call it a society, but there's so many layers in it. It's so complex that when you talk about how we can go forward as a society, we also need to look at the people that are backwards, like they're in the back, if you like. So they can't really move forward because they're poor, or they're less educated, or they have a perceived or a real sense of no opportunities. So if we just focus on the UiPaths of the world, I think we're in a bit of a problem. They're really important as models to follow and inspire. But my strong thesis is that we need to get down there with the people. And this in itself is a very arrogant approach. But I think we lost too many trains as the bubble that we call ourselves, whatever the name is. And if we don't find a way to engage more people in our conversations, in the way we work, in the way we dream, I think it's not going to really work out very well. I don't think we're heading for a very dramatic scenario, but I think it's not necessarily going to be better.
Yeah, we are not progressing as quick as we want to.
And at the same time, let's not forget where we are. We are in Europe, which is not a bad place to be at all. But at the same time, if we look at, let's take a 30 or let's take a 40-year approach, right? What happens by 2050? Let's keep it short. 30 is short, right? This is a world where most likely Europe is not going to necessarily be a strong global leader from an economics perspective for a variety of reasons, mainly connected to capital and tech and market and aging and etc. But in the same time, Vienna is going to look really amazing in 30 years again. Sofia is going to really be cool. So the standard of life and the desire to be in Europe will still be there. I think there's trains that we can hop in as Europe, and we can become leaders and pioneers in some technologies like AI, but we're a long way back. Blockchain, we're back. Quantum computing, not that well. So if you take all these new tech, deep tech, the forces of the future, if you like, sustainability, etc., we're not at the forefront. We're not there in anything. But we can be there as well. When you talk about Bulgaria or Serbia or Romania, I think these are countries that can have some form of leapfrogging. But we all need to do the leapfrogging, not just the very fancy elite of the coffee shops in Bucharest and so.
Awesome. All right. Last question for our conversation. Ciprian, what would you like to be remembered for?
I honestly, I don't want to be remembered for anything. I think besides my family, I would like to be remembered. But besides that, I think it's a very difficult mental step for many of us to actually look at this type of question and say, I don't want to be remembered for. I want to be remembered, or organizations, companies impact, I would like to be remembered. Do you know the name of the CEO of Ford of the 60s?
I do.
Yeah? Well, most people don't. Do you know the name of the CEO of GE of the 70s that revolutionized industries? Most likely not.
I have a clue, but I'm not very certain about them.
So if I want to be, I would like not to be remembered
Yeah.
necessarily. I would mind, right? But I would like the things that I do from now on and in the past to have a meaning and impact, and to create a model of sustainable business making that is engraved in the way people do what they do.
Ciprian Stanescu, thank you so much for being on the Recursive podcast. It was great having you, and can't wait to have you back.
In the next episode of the Recursive podcast, Irina talks to the seasoned manager and managing partner at Impact Hub Bucharest, Ilin Capone.
You in. You are the perfect material if your personality wants to evolve on the ladder, to grow as a career, to go up the ladder. This idea of going up the ladder means effort, stress, pressure, being the first in the office, leaving the last, okay, working weekends, working evenings. Why? Because the corporate is, let's say, using you to the maximum. Mm-hmm. The system welcomes these personalities. And you can learn immensely, okay? You will make a lot of money, but your house will be a mess.
And if you're just as passionate about innovation as we are, hit subscribe for the Recursive podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. We're everywhere.